Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk It Up Tuesdays. I'm here with Jolee Cave, who's one of our advocacy team members. And we're going to talk today about setting the record straight, 10 myth-busting facts that you may or may not know about sexual assault. But before we get started, I want to share a little bit about our organization, The Turning Point. So at The Turning Point, we serve survivors of sexual violence in North Texas. Our mission is to provide counseling, education, and advocacy for all those impacted by sexual violence. We have a crisis hotline. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That number is 1-800-886-7273. Jolee, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yes, I'm so happy to be here. I love Talking Up Tuesdays.
Well, so we can go ahead and we'll launch straight into our facts and just kind of gauge, if it's surprising, if it's not, and maybe what it dispels. So our first fact is that locally and nationally, less than 20% of sexual assaults are committed by strangers.
Yeah, I think what people don't really see is that most time abusers, it's somebody that you know and somebody that you trust, and it can be family, friends, maybe even acquaintances, that one coworker, things like that. And I think that's definitely, it's not so much shocking, but kind of jarring to think about, I think, for anybody, just to know that it could be someone within your circle.
Yeah, and I know growing up, I grew up and it was stranger danger was all the rage and concern, and every sort of narrative about sexual assault was this stranger in the dark. And this really puts it in a different perspective that sexual assault, most of them occur when you already have some sort of relationship with the individual.
Mm-hmm. For sure. No, that one is pretty shocking. Most of these are very shocking. The next one we have is that most sexual assaults occur in a home, either of the survivor, offender, or a friend.
So this one really hits at that heart of like, if you don't go to dangerous places, dangerous things won't happen. And this is completely telling you the opposite. In reality, most of this type of assaults actually occur in places where we feel safe, in homes of ourselves, of a friend, or if we have a relationship of the offender. Were you surprised by this one at all?
I was not too maybe surprised by this one, but I think it also kind of leads into victim blaming as well. Because a lot of people say, well, you went over to their house. Oh, well, you did that. And like, that doesn't mean I'm consenting to any type of sexual activity or anything like that. And people should feel comfortable to freely go to someone's house after a date or whatever the situation is without fear of being sexually assaulted. So I just thought that kind of played into that as well. But that point is great that like they do tell you, don't go to this place, don't go to this place, but it can happen anywhere at any time.
Yeah. So our next fact is that anyone can be assaulted, regardless of gender, race, economic status, age, etc. Most survivors are female, or people from marginalized communities tend to be more disproportionately affected. But sexual assault can happen to anyone.
Yeah, and I definitely think, playing into those disproportions and things, it can come from a community level, a societal level, and there's all types of factors playing into those disproportions. But truly, sexual assault can happen to anyone, like you said. It doesn't, some people might think like, oh, well, it would never happen to me, but genuinely, like, people never know.
Right. It can affect everyone. And so much about what we talk about is that sexual assault is based on power and control.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so when you look at those who have more power exerting their will onto those with less power, less voice, less security, it kind of frames that. And all of us at some point are going to be in a position maybe of less physical power, of less voice or social power that can make us vulnerable. And so it's these kind of at the root of the problem. I think
Yeah.
this one really shows.
And that leads us directly into the next fact of sexual assault is a crime of power and control. Like you said, most offenders choose their potential victims based on opportunity, accessibility, and vulnerability. And I think this definitely is something to think about with what types of power there is. There's financial power over someone, like you said, physical power over someone, you know, job, like the way that it's set up, you know, boss and an employee, and there's all types of power dynamics in a lot of areas of society.
Yeah. And so what this one really, sometimes we think like, oh, because it's sexual violence, we tend to think it relates to sex or lust or passion or something like that. But when we look at the heart of sexual assault, it actually is based in this power and control. And these ideas of what somebody looks for when they're going to assault someone: opportunity, accessibility, and vulnerability. And so really you can see it doesn't matter what I'm wearing or you know, my reputation or it really has to do with this moment in time of accessibility, opportunity, and vulnerability. And the person making the decision to commit the assault is the one responsible making those choices.
And I also think it's a misconception that people think that these abusers are only doing this for sexual gratification, because from those power dynamics and from that feeling of, I guess, having power over someone, they're gratified in that way as well. And I think that's something that we just don't talk about a lot in that.
Yeah, and I think you can really see for people who step outside of whether it's gender norms or societal norms tend to be vulnerable, because this is a form of power. This is a form of punishment that people often use to put people back in the boxes, whether it's sexual orientation, gender identity, all of those kind of components. This is sometimes can be a social tool of power or control to make sure people are behaving in a certain way.
And like privileges as well play into that. If someone, you know, they believe that they have more privileges than you, and that they want to, like, you know, I guess further that, that's also that I totally agree with everything.
So let's see. So okay, so here we're kind of shifting gears a little bit. So this fact says that during an assault, many survivors experience tonic immobility or freeze, which is a natural biological survival response to trauma that causes a person's body to feel stiff, rigid, or unable to move.
Yeah.
So we hear all the time people maybe blaming themselves after an assault. Like, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I scream? They can blame themselves. And sometimes you even hear it socially. Well, why didn't you do blah, blah, blah?
Yeah.
And that is one of, I think, the biggest misconceptions, is that we have these natural trauma responses that are biological. They help us survive dangerous situations. But in the case of sexual assault, oftentimes that response is to freeze. It's not to fight back. And a lot of times fleeing is not an opportunity. And that's a
lot. Yeah. And a lot of people think that if you didn't fight back, then, oh, that's consent. And it's there, you know, that's an entire misconception, is that, like you said, like our body, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And your body does what it needs to do to survive in that moment. And it is the more common response is to freeze in that moment, because you're just, you know, your body kind of shuts down in a way where it's like, okay, we just need to get you through this moment, and we will reevaluate, you know, after the fact. But no, I definitely think it's good to really push that fact in the point of, if you didn't fight back, it doesn't mean it's your fault. It doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It doesn't mean that you know, should have done this, should have done that. It's never supposed to, the blame should never be on the victim for that.
And sometimes people feel betrayed by their bodies, but it's important to understand, like, your body is it's trying to help you survive. And that betrayal, I know, can cause a lot of havoc mentally, but just understanding, like, that these are natural responses for survival that aren't something that we necessarily can control logically.
Yeah, and I wish people just knew this was more of a widespread fact, so that they wouldn't, just feel so, blaming themselves and feel so shameful of like how they might have responded in a situation. Because I think if people really knew how common this response is, and not just, sexual trauma, in all types of trauma. Freeze happens all the time with people. So I think, but it's because of the lack of maybe knowledge about this particular body response, because you hear fight flight all the time, but freeze is the one that's often forgotten, even though it's the most common. So I think that definitely is something I wish that people knew more about.
Yeah.
So this next fact that we're going into says rates of false reports of sexual assault are the same as most other felonies, about 2 to 8%. And I definitely think that like false reporting is something that people just think happens all the time, and that people, just, you know, um, like that it's the norm for people to lie about sexual assault, but it's actually the exact opposite. Like this says, it's the same as any other crime. It's just, yes, there is a certain percentage, but it's not, the commonality or anything like that.
Yeah, I actually read somewhere, and I couldn't find it when I was looking, but that actually arson tends to be the one that most people lie
That's
about for
shocking.
like insurance money.
Wow. That's very interesting to know that. Wow. But
So the next fact is an individual's response to sexual assault is unique and normal. It is not uncommon for individuals to be sober, hysteric, unresponsive, confused, angry, experience uncontrollable laughter. Basically, this fact is just stating that everyone responds uniquely to this type of sexual trauma. And you can't decide by a person's reaction what actually occurred, didn't occur. Like, it's not a form of judgment. It's just needs to be understood that when our bodies are in trauma, we all react in different ways, especially after the fact that something has happened.
Yeah. And your body's response, and maybe like your, those type of responses, like it still does not equal consent. If some people try to confuse like, oh, well, if you weren't acting this way, then that means that you consented. And it's like, no, if the consent was not clear and given, then and I think that's also a form of where victims blame themselves if they think that their response was wrong, or they're like, well, why did I do that? Why did I do that during that moment? And I think it just all relates back to that, where it's not your fault that this happened. There's never going to be a point where you would be at fault for this. So
Yeah, so this is actually our law enforcement trainer, Brian Fawning, who is on here a few weeks ago. But this is one of the things that he does when he goes with police departments to train them to talk about, traumatic responses of survivors, is talking that, and this is, I think, is an understanding that's shifted over time, but especially for investigators, for police, like, you can't judge the veracity of someone's story by how you perceive them as responding, because that impact of trauma, and then when people are telling their story, or if they confide in a friend, or the responses can be so all over the place, just depending on the person and how they react to trauma.
yeah, and their reactions can change with time as well. There might be, if it happens to be that you had, like, the assault happened and you just went straight to the hospital, straight to the police or something, your body could still be in that freeze, and your body can still be in those certain natural responses. And it's unfortunate that these type of responses can be met with disbelief, or be met with, oh, like, maybe, this is involved or something like that, instead of and the thing is, that same person months later, a week later, 2 days later, could have a different response to this as well. So I definitely think it's important. And I think this fact is one that I hope that is not as surprising, is that there's not just one response. There's not a correct response. There's not, no response is wrong. It's just going to be unique to you.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. And then this next fact, and this is one that I think was shocking to me when I first got here. And, part of the Turning Point team and learned about this. It's in Texas, less than 10% of sexual assaults are reported to law enforcement. Um, that's huge. And
So this statistic actually comes from a 2015 survey done by the UT Social Work Department in coordination with TASA and some others on the prevalence of sexual violence. So I think nationally, that is about 30%, but in this survey, this found that out of all of those who reported sexual assault in their lifetime, less than 10% had gone to police. And so we can begin to think like, why would somebody hesitate to go to the police? And then once we can put ourselves in that perspective, you can see there's a lot of barriers for why.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that once you really do the digging and kind of think about it, there are many, many reasons that people don't report. I mean, like we were talking about earlier, it's usually not going to be a stranger. So it could be someone that's in your family that's tied to your financials and things like that. So there's things like that where you're scared of repercussions from reporting, or of like losing financial stability. There's always kind of doubts in the legal system, of course, and lots of people distrust of the legal system and not wanting to kind of give their story and go through this whole process. And I also think that a lot of people, it's also shame. You don't want to have to tell more people about it. And then also, I think what can be kind of intimidating is that you feel like it might prolong the process of healing, is because you have to go through the whole process of reporting, and maybe there might be a court case. There are just months and months of trying to get the justice that you want can be hard on someone that might be vulnerable to re-victimization through that process.
Yeah, and I think you start to see these barriers, particularly in groups of marginalized populations. So
definitely,
certainly if you if maybe you're a member of the LGBTQ community and you're not out to your family and something happened like that, that could be really there's a lot of personal reasons that go in that. If you maybe come from a community where there is distrust in the legal system, or immigrant community, language barriers, particularly, there's just so many different factors.
Cultural norms, if it's a thing that, it happened within your family and you just, your family doesn't talk about it, your family isn't going to address it, then you feel maybe unsupported. You don't have a good support system to go through that process of reporting. Because definitely a strong support system can really help through that process of just being there for you through every step. So I definitely agree with marginalized communities are definitely affected disproportionately by this, and especially relationships with the legal system itself.
So our second to last fact is that in Texas, consent cannot be present if a survivor is under 17 years old. And I think probably a lot of us have this understanding that, okay, if somebody is under 17 and it doesn't matter if the other person knows that they're under 17 or not, like legally that person can't consent. That's sexual assault. I would hope that by now that's pretty common knowledge, but particularly among young people coming up, I think that can be really shocking because
and I think a hard thing is that, a 3-year gap doesn't seem like much for a relationship when it's maybe a 30-year-old and a 33-year-old, both two consenting adults to a relationship. That's not out of the norm. But when you bring it down to 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, you have to think about the fact of developmentally, your brains are in different areas. You're in different parts of your life. You're not like children are not, don't have the capacity to consent to something like that as well. And so I hope that would be more known, but also I know that it's not, because you see those type of relationships all the time. I mean, I know even just in growing up and things like that, there was 14-year-olds with 18-year-olds, or maybe a 21-year-old that hung around the school. And it's way too common. And it's hard to swallow that that's so common.
Yeah, I definitely think it is.
Yeah. And then that brings us to our last busting fact is that in Texas, consent cannot be present if the survivor is incapacitated by drugs, alcohol, illness, or disability. And I think this one is one that I'm glad. That makes me happy that that's a fact in Texas, because genuinely, I think that's a lot of victim blaming comes from that. Well, why did you go to that party? Why did you drink so much? Why did you put yourself in a position to be sexually assaulted? And it's, you should be able to enjoy a drink without that type of fear. You should be able to, you know, not have to blame yourself just because you wanted to go to a party with your friends. And you have to think about the fact that abusers, they're looking for people in vulnerable stages, or they're looking for to take advantage of that vulnerability. So
Yeah, and I think that that's really key too for just people to be aware of in general, that maybe if you have the assumption that you're going to have sex with someone and that person then becomes intoxicated, like the solution there is to wait until they are not intoxicated, because consent is something that can be reversed. And if somebody is
yeah,
intoxicated, they can't legally give
definitely.
consent. And it's just really important to respect boundaries of one another, and to have an understanding of what a healthy relationship is, with communication and respect for boundaries, and certainly knowing kind of the legal contours of this. Like even the law says that if somebody is incapacitated with alcohol or drugs, like it's assault. If they
Yeah.
can.
And that's, I definitely, and I agree. I like that you said, you know, consent can be reversed at any point. It doesn't matter. Okay, they agreed to go to a party with you. Okay. They agreed to kiss you before you got drunk. Okay. It doesn't mean that they're consenting to every part of sexual activity that you might have in mind or whatever it is. And that's, I think that's definitely a point to drive home for people, is that, you know, now the law backs it too. If they're incapacitated in any way, it is assault. So
Yeah. So wrapping up, these are our 10 myth busting facts. So I hope anybody listening that maybe learned something new. If maybe if you have one you would like to share, you can post below in the comments on Facebook. But thank you, Jolee,
yeah,
for
of course.
joining me
Thank
for this
you.
conversation.
Yeah, thank you for all you do. And I think this is great to really spread awareness about these facts that people don't know. And I'm just so happy that I got to discuss this with you. Thank you so much, Amy.
Great. Well, we'll be back here next Tuesday for Talk It Up Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye.